We have been here before, the West wringing its hands over what to do about Russia's militaristic might. But it's not the Cold War, it's today's Ukraine, faced with Russian troops in Crimea and the threat that those troops might expand elsewhere. Joining us now to discuss what's unfolding near the Black Sea. In New York, New York, Walter Russell Meade, the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and the Humanities at Bard College. Also in New York, via Skype, Nina Khrushcheva, Professor of International Affairs at the New School for Public Engagement. And with us here in the studio, Jeffrey Kopstein, former Director for the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto, Lucan Way, Professor of Political Science, also at the U of T, and Stavros Rugas, who recently spent time in Ukraine as an elections monitor. We want to remind all of you watching us at home that our online producer, Elamin Abdulmahmoud, is hosting a Twitter chat on this topic right now, so please weigh in with your views on the crisis in Ukraine and use the hashtag AgendaTVO. Walter Russell Meade got us started. I like simple questions, so let's start simple. Why has Russia done what it's done?
Well, I think some people have been saying because it can. But I think, President Putin considers the future of Ukraine something that Russia can't ignore. It's a vital interest. He was worried about Crimea. He saw an opportunity where the West had sort of let things slip. There was a gap between our rhetoric and what we were ready to do, and he moved very quickly.
Nina, your view on why Russia has done what it's done?
Because it can. I mean, I think it's very well put. And also, Crimea being such an important interest of Russia was under Russian control until 1954, and then by chance got out of the Russian control. So Putin considers it his own territory, and therefore he feels that he can annex it as he just announced.
Jeffrey, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Should they have done this?
Well, it was a propitious time for them to do it because their client had just fallen from power in Ukraine.
Yanukovych.
President Yanukovych had fallen from power, and the country has kind of, descended into a mild degree of anarchy. And under the conditions of lack of public authority, this made it all the much easier for Putin to go in to an area where he worried. And the reason he worried was because there's a treaty that Russia has signed with Ukraine to run their Black Sea fleet out of Crimea. And that treaty would normally not come up till 2042. They signed a treaty that long, but with whoever will be in power now, if it's not a Russian client, they'll probably have to leave there by 2017. That's what he's worried about.
Because they'll abrogate the treaty, or there's an out clause or something like that?
Yeah, they can get out of it.
They can get out of it. This, again, Lucan, on the face of it, may seem like an obvious question, but was this an invasion?
I'm not an expert on that, but I think most people would consider it an invasion when you have foreign troops coming on Ukraine's territory, yes. And I think also Putin is worried about his own political future. What happened in Ukraine is his own worst nightmare. I think that both in the Arab Spring in 2011 and the Ukrainian Revolution, you had autocrats who were considered quite strong, suddenly overthrown by spontaneous, leaderless revolts. And if that doesn't make you paranoid, well, I seriously don't know what would. And so I think what his main aim is, he wants to discredit this. He wants to show the Russian public that when this happens, what you have is chaos and hopefully civil war.
Hopefully civil war?
In Putin's mind.
In Putin's mind,
Yeah,
okay.
sorry, no.
Stavros, when were you most recently in Ukraine?
2012, during the parliamentary election.
And what did you do when you were there?
I was a long-term observer with the Canadian delegation, so I was there for 2 months in Poltava Oblast.
Which is where?
Which is not far from Kiev, about 3 hours.
And what did you do when you were there?
So the idea is to be responsible for that Oblast, which is essentially a province, the equivalent in Ukraine or former Soviet Union, many of them, is to go around to kind of watch the process leading up to the election. So we'd go to different regions around, and you kind of get a sense of what the people are thinking in those villages, in those places that are outside of those big power centers that get more exposure, and that kind of everyday life, which is it's meat and potatoes, if you will, literally and figuratively.
Do you speak Ukrainian?
I do not. I speak Russian, and probably the first insight from that is that if you are in Ukraine, you are better off only speaking Russian than you are only speaking Ukrainian.
Why is that?
Because everybody speaks Russian and not everybody speaks Ukrainian. Most people, I would say, arguably everybody understands Ukrainian. But so there's that kind of scenario where you've got already, it's getting complicated because you've got ethnic Ukrainians who prefer Russian but they are Ukrainian, and don't tell them they're Russian. So this starts to, I think we'll get into this in the hour, is that the idea that on face value and that kind of breaking headline is maybe not exactly the reality of people, how they live every day.
Okay, more to come on that. Again, back to geopolitics. Walter Russell Meade, the Crimea. What's so important about that, geopolitically speaking?
Well, I think we've mentioned it already, and that's those are the naval bases on the that are there. Russia has facilities. If Russia does not have a lot of ports, good ports, and without the Crimea, it really doesn't have a way to project naval power into the Black Sea and the Mediterranean.
And is it your view that whatever treaty that had been negotiated with the guy who's now, I guess, actually out of power, but not technically out of power, that treaty is suspect enough that Putin had to do what he did?
I think he probably had. If the treaty were the only issue on his mind, I think he could have gotten some kind of an agreement. But we should clarify a little bit. Yanukovych wasn't exactly Putin's puppet. In fact, Yanukovych was going to sign the accession agreement with the European Union. And while he's a man who comes from the eastern part of the country, which historically people have considered a little bit closer to Russia, the fact that you had an Easterner willing to move Ukraine west was a huge danger to Putin. And Putin, in a sense, his strongest intervention was to force Yanukovych, a combination perhaps of bribery, perhaps of force, twisting arms behind the scenes, one doesn't know, but to force Yanukovych to give up his move toward the European Union, which then resulted in the kind of revolution that we saw. So Putin's worst-case scenario was not this month. It was actually last November at the prospect that a united Ukrainian under an Easterner would move toward the European Union. That would break up Putin's primary dream, which is the recreation kind of the Soviet Union under the guise of something he calls the Eurasian Union. Okay. And Putin saw a mortal threat to that dream, and I think that since then he's been acting to block it. He knows the West was eager to get Ukraine into that association with the European Union, and so he saw this as a direct challenge by the West to his vital interests. But he also saw the West hadn't thought much about it, hadn't realized how hard he would fight to defend himself there. And so he took an opportunity.
Nina, would you weigh in on the issue of how much the West is culpable in what has transpired in Ukraine by virtue of its, as some have put it, lack of diligence or vigilance on this issue?
Well, the West is certainly culpable because they had, it's not the first Ukrainian revolution, as we must remember. 2004, Yanukovych was became Ukrainian president with Putin's support, and then was ousted because it was deeply undemocratic the way he came in. And so there was an Orange Revolution, and different pro-Western leadership came in. So the West actually had at least 6 years to think what its policy towards Ukraine should be, because Yanukovych was elected then as a Ukrainian president in 2010. So there were solid 6 years to figure out what the policies were. And people, a lot of analysts and a lot of experts and people like me who write about this kind of things did write about this, that the West really should invest in Ukraine, because in some ways we should have understood that Ukraine is the last line of defense for the West and Russia at the time, something that Poland was in the last decades of the Soviet Union. It was not done. So the blame goes much, much farther than just November that we are talking about. And then, of course, as was very correctly pointed out, Putin did see the problem with the West's strategy towards how to take Ukraine back out of the Russian influence, and Putin is a brilliant opportunist. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. I think very few people saw anything like that. He's a great tactician. So every time when he sees a weakness in somebody else's position, he seizes it on it and takes it as his own advantage. He's really a great political opportunist and politician of opportunity this way.
Lucan, you wanted to follow.
Well, a couple of things. One, I think it's important to recognize that Ukraine is not Poland, that Ukraine is truly divided. I mean, we've been talking a lot about geopolitics, and it certainly makes sense now. But I think during the events, it was oftentimes asserted that there was broad majority support for the European Union within Ukraine. That is simply not the case. Almost all polls showed about a 50% support for the European Union, less support for the Eurasian Union. So the European Union had a plurality, but certainly not a serious majority.
Let's be clear, though. In the western part of Ukraine, overwhelming support for the European project.
Yes.
In the eastern part of Ukraine, not much at all.
Not much at all.
Fair to say.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Okay.
So I think that's important. So I think it's possible to overemphasize geopolitics in this. The other thing is, I think Putin may be a great tactician. He's an awful strategist. Because if you wanted Ukraine to join the Eurasian Union, you can be sure that that's off the table. No, Ukrainian politician is ever going to trust Putin ever again.
Consequences are too dire.
Consequences are too dire, and even in eastern Ukraine, in a major eastern capital of Kharkiv, you had a Russian flag being flown over the local parliamentary building. Turned out a Russian who flew that flag. Even pro-Russian Ukrainians don't like that kind of.
Stavros, I've heard, actually, or I've read references in the newspapers over the last few days to the fact that Russian flags are all over eastern Ukraine now, but if you were there a month ago, you wouldn't have found any. Is that right?
Well, I wasn't there a month ago exactly to say, but I think Lucan makes a good point that, I guess he's referring to that idea where these flags are coming from. This is the kind of idea of looking at things on face value, that there are flags popping up, but they've also played the game where in Maidan there's certain flags, so others are putting flags. So it's a bit unclear. And if we're looking particularly at Crimea, and we break down Crimea's ethnicity, different issues within there, yes, it's Russian speaking, because most often in the former Soviet Union, this goes for outside of Ukraine, people that are not ethnic to that homeland, say in Kazakhstan, they're not Kazakh, they tend to prefer Russian as a native language, or often only speak Russian. So even though there are Tatars and different ethnic groups that are comprised, especially Tatars and Russians, Ukrainians, in Crimea, there's a different makeup there. So the idea that it's overwhelmingly kind of Russian, it's kind of these murky waters that are tricky to understand. The bit of the east-west, like if you look at Donetsk in some cities in the west of Ukraine, it's a bit easier to understand. But even if you get into Kiev, it's not as clear that it's just all Ukrainians, and the amount of mixed families and people in Russia. Ukraine is considered part of who they are. The idea of having Ukrainian blood is normal. So many people will have Ukrainian names that are Russian, and maybe and vice versa, and that's not unusual. So Ukraine, from the former Soviet Union, but they live in a place like Kazakhstan, which I've lived in, and that is in another part of the former Soviet Union, is considered a bit different, and even Georgia to a certain extent. But Ukraine is much closer to that, and I don't want to speak, to exactly what that means, but there's a closer tie with Russia, and they look at it from a cultural point of view, and the kind of internal support you get is different than something that's kind of far away.
Okay, let me go back to the point that was just made about Putin, and Jeff, get you to speak to this, which is when the distinction between being a good strategist versus a good tactician was just raised, you nodded and said absolutely. Right. What are you referring to there?
What's the end game, right? What exactly does he want here, right? So
do we know the answer to that?
No, we don't. At a minimum, he wants some kind of disposition changed permanently in the Crimea. I think that's fairly clear, right? And if that's all he wants, then that could be negotiated. As Walter Russell Meade said, that's something that could be done.
What if the end game is we don't want increasing westernization of a country that's on our borders?
Well, then the question is what is he willing to do in order to stop that?
Well, move troops in, for one.
Well, but he hasn't moved troops yet into mainland Ukraine. Mm-hmm. If he did that, right, then I think you'd probably have a military response of some sort. And it wouldn't be just from the east, right? You'd also get people from the west going to the east, especially those in the west who had grandpa fought against the Soviets. Remember, it's important to remember that there were anti-Soviet partisans who stayed in the woods until the early 1950s fighting the Red Army, right, and fighting the NKVD, the KGB units in the woods. And they've heard about this from grandpa and grandma through the years. The idea of taking up weapons to go fight the Moskali, the the damned Russians, as I think is a nice translation of that, over in eastern Ukraine. That's something that I think a lot of people would latch on to. It might be very bloody and terrible. Nobody really wants to go there. Nobody thought 3 years ago, nobody thought that Ukraine was going to turn into Yugoslavia. Now, hopefully it will not. But if the Russians, Soviets, if the Russians actually invade mainland Ukraine proper, I think all bets are off. That would be, if that's what they do, Putin's endgame there is the breakup of Ukraine itself. And that could happen.
As in East and West Germany of this generation.
Yeah, and West Ukraine then could join the European Union. And East Ukraine would then become part of some Eurasian Union.
Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. I want to get to that. But Walter, first, help us understand this. I know most of the reaction in the Western media so far has been, oh my goodness, here's Putin trying to recraft a quote-unquote Soviet empire for the 21st century. But I wonder if you could help us sort of get into the heads of those people who live in the eastern part of Ukraine. Do you think they fear an increasing westernization of their country, which they don't want? And do we need to understand that from the Western point of view?
I think it's very, very complicated. Again, we're talking about millions of people, and amazingly, they all have different opinions in different situations in life. But we have to remember that, you know, there was no international boundary between Ukraine and Russia until 1990, and travel back and forth was pretty easy. There are a lot of people in eastern Ukraine who have family on the other side of the border. There are a lot of mixed families. One of the things that concerned them, for example, about European Union association is would there be some sort of a visa barrier between them and their families in Russia? You also have eastern Ukraine is mostly where Ukraine's heavy industry is. There are a lot of steel mills, mining, that kind of thing there. And these companies basically are oriented toward the Russian market and have long-standing trade links that go back, again, well into Soviet times. It's not at all clear that these industries would benefit by trading more freely with the European Union. In fact, cheap imports from Europe might well price out a lot of these industries. So what you have is a mix of economic and personal questions. The cultural thing, I think, might come in on top of that. But it's, and in some ways exacerbated. But it's, again, this is where I think Nina and I would probably both agree, and maybe some of the other guests as well. When we talk about the West failing to develop a strategy for Ukraine, in part what we're saying is, I don't think anybody in the European Union, or for that matter in Washington, D.C., really sat down and thought hard about, okay, if we would like a united Ukraine to move to the West, what does that mean we have to think about for eastern Ukraine? How do we make a proposition to these people that makes sense to them? And I don't think anything was really done that way. And one of the results is the divided country that you see.
Nina, can I get you to weigh in just on that issue of whether or not it is a legitimate argument that Russia is going to bat for people in the eastern part of that country who fear being subsumed by the West and its so-called values?
Well, actually, I don't. I don't think that it is a legitimate. I mean, it is, of course, all our arguments could ultimately be legitimate. I don't think that it's a really such an important argument here, because Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine, they were Ukraine, and only when Russia interfered and destabilized their environment, their situation, all of a sudden it became such a pressing issue that Eastern Ukraine, which, by the way, Kyiv is part of too. So this goes to unanimity of Eastern Ukrainians not wanting to be part of Ukraine and wanting to be part of Russia. So that issue brought to the fore, and then other forces took over, and we ended up with a revolution. But I don't think, going back to various conversations before that, I don't think that Putin plans to take over Ukraine. Even Eastern Ukraine. He understands that it's going to be a very difficult and very costly. It's already costly as it is, but very costly situation. But he does want Crimea for the fleet, for the Russian glory, but also for his own sort of psychological need. He just conducted this stunning Olympics in Sochi and Crimea would be one of those great conquests of Vladimir Putin that other leaders before him couldn't do or squandered away. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. In 1991, Boris Yeltsin didn't claim it back from independent Ukraine already. And so Putin charges on his white horse and really becomes everybody's hero. It is true, he's a great tactician. He is a very bad strategist. And we already, in economic terms, will see this thing unfolding quite badly for him.
Stavros.
I think we can look at neighboring Moldova. There's a certain analogy there. There's a breakaway republic called Transnistria.
Stand by. Let's control room if we can. Let's bring the map up again so we can see this part of the world. And then, Stavros, when you see the map, okay, there's Moldova just to the west of Odessa.
So Moldova is a small landlocked country, probably not well known to people because it's small and very poor. And a part of it is called Transnistria, which essentially since the end of the Soviet Union has been a de facto state. And that's where actually the industrial base was. So that country gives a sense of the problems when the industrial base leaves. I mean, it's economically, it's quite poor. But the other thing is, when we're looking at Crimea, maybe the best case scenario now can be Crimea is going to turn into a kind of a Transnistria, which means Russian troops are there. They essentially control it. It's not officially part of Russia.
So they won't annex it, technically,
yeah,
but they're in control of it.
Yeah, a little, similarities to what happened in Georgia. So this is one that I think some of the other guests here can probably get into a bit more. But if we're trying to look at concrete examples of what can happen, because I spent some time, in Moldova there, and I actually went into Transnistria, and it's just kind of an odd place. Nothing's happening in a way, and it's controlled by essentially, a dictator with Russian support. And in the long term, that's obviously bad news for Europe, for everybody, but it leads to an inertia.
And you think that could be a template for what we're seeing in
Ukraine? You could see in Crimea, and then the next 50 years you're looking at there. There's no reason for that to change quickly if it takes place.
Well, a couple of things. I think, Moldova is actually an interesting case because what happened, because of the Russian support for Transnistria, even the pro-Russian communists, when they came to power in the 2000s, were forced to be pro-European because being pro-Russian meant giving up on Transnistria, and that was completely unpalatable for the Moldovan domestic public opinion. And I think what will happen I think it's very likely that basically Putin has his port. No one's going to take it away. That's forever. I'll make that prediction. But I can tell you what it's going to do is it's going to mean the rest of Ukraine, it's going to be very hard for a pro-Russian leader to come to power and actually have a true alliance with Putin.
Well, Jeffrey, there has been a great deal of instability, it goes without saying, in the past month in Ukraine. Is there an argument, and I know Nina says, yes, you can make an argument about anything, but is it a good argument to say that by putting those troops into Crimea, Putin is bringing some stability to a part of the world that hasn't known much of it lately?
I don't know about that. I think the problem with that is precisely because he has not announced his intentions. Right? I think there's a good argument to be made that Putin really wants to keep a hand in Ukrainian politics. And this is not simply that he can do it, that the time is propitious for doing it because the public authority has collapsed, but this is a big, giant statement, right? That Ukraine just can't do whatever it wants. And so either you'll see a kind of a best case scenario is a kind of a neutralization of Ukraine. It's interesting, a Russian diplomat came into my center a few years ago, and I think Lukin was there for it. And he said something that I can't get out of my mind. Right? He said, why do you care about Ukraine? Ukraine, it's flat, it's far away from you, it's weak. Only we care about it. Nobody else really cares about it except us.
He obviously doesn't know, he or she obviously doesn't know there's 1 million Ukrainians in Canada.
Yeah, I know.
Who do care a lot about it.
And they care a great deal about it. I'm not making an argument for the Russian diplomat. What I am saying is that even in an open meeting, right, he's essentially trying to tell us, look, this is our near abroad. This is our backyard. This is the Russian equivalent of the Monroe Doctrine. We're not going to allow just outsiders to mess in this area. And I think that's a really big statement. And Putin's leaving it unclear. He's leaving it ambiguous. And so therefore, I don't think it can be really a recipe for stability unless it forces Easterners and Westerners to sit down and say, look, the one thing we can agree on is we don't want this SOB. Right? We don't want this SOB. And no matter what we disagree about, right? We don't want him. If that's the case, then he's doing Ukraine a great favor. I don't think that's actually the case, though. I think Putin's leaving it really ambiguous, and we haven't seen the end of this story yet. We're far from the end.
Walter, based on your knowledge of the history and the present, would you say that the troops being sent into this area of the world represents the first step towards an official annexation of this territory, which, after all, once was part of Russia?
I think if they do that, they're likely to go in stages and first proclaim an autonomous republic and then maybe have a referendum on joining Russia. It's more or less what happened in Texas when it joined the United States. But I think, I think in a lot of our conversation, we're forgetting that one of the big differences between Ukraine and Russia on the one hand and the West on the other is that the Ukrainian state is a very, very weak state. The most important moment in modern post-Soviet Russian history is really when Vladimir Putin broke the oligarchs and sort of elevated himself and the Russian state above the oligarchs. And in Ukraine, the oligarchs who emerged in that chaotic privatization and frenzy of enrichment after the collapse of communism are still kind of shadowy figures. Some of what they do is legal, maybe. Some of what they do isn't. Political parties tend to reflect as much the interests of the dominant oligarch who's a paymaster of the party than any sort of standard of abstract political principles. And these oligarchs have enjoyed the space. They don't really want to get too close to the European Union because then all these tedious accountants and lawyers from Brussels are going to come out and start asking questions and expecting them to pay taxes. But on the other hand, if Russia gets too close, then they'll be like the Russian oligarchs and sort of ground under the heel of Putin, and all of their wealth will be theirs only as long as he permits them to have it. So the situation in Ukraine is extremely fluid. There are lots of actors. The institutions of government, even before the revolution, only inexactly and vaguely reflect the actual power realities in the country. So this is not some simple situation that you can sort of walk in with a rule book and have everything work. Putin can't do it, and the West can't do it.
Jeffrey.
Just to back up what Walter Russell Meade just said, it's not only that the no Ukrainian government has broken the oligarchs. In fact, the current provisional government has started appointing the oligarchs, many oligarchs, to be regional governors. So one of the richest, Kolomoisky, has now been made head of Dnipropetrovsk, which is one of the kind of the strongest industrial, most populous regions of Ukraine. And so the current government is relying on the oligarchs and both their money and their soft power and their control over media assets in order to try to consolidate its power.
Do you see that as a good or a bad thing?
Well, it's an act of necessity, right? It's because they really lack a strong state. They're forced to rely on, if you will, these kind of little states, minigarchs, if you will, right? These little kind of local states. You can't think of a state in this area in Ukraine as a kind of a separate bureaucracy with its own esprit de corps that operates according to the rule of law. They really are the kind of playthings of wealthy people. Think of them as kind of guys with guns. Right, and not really as a state as we would normally understand it here in Canada.
Got it. Lucan.
So I actually want to talk about the Ukrainian government. We haven't brought that in. But I think the big problem right now is that you have a government in Kiev that's widely thought to have come to power via a coup. And I think that's a big problem. It's a big problem. And I think what you need right now are elections as soon as possible. You basically need a legitimate government that truly represents all of Ukraine. And if that happens, I think Putin could ironically unite Ukraine. Right? That this is actually a possibility that, I don't think even in eastern Ukraine, it's not clear that they like the idea of Russian troops marching across the border. I mean, I lived 8 months in Donetsk, and I can tell you in eastern Ukraine, which is where Yanukovych is from, I can tell you even as pro-Russian as they are, I don't think they like to be invaded. So.
Can I just get Nina on this issue of whether or not it looks to your eyes like a coup has just transpired and therefore this government doesn't have legitimacy in the eyes of the world right now?
Well, I actually think it does have legitimacy in the eyes of the world. It just doesn't have legitimacy in the eyes of some people in Ukraine and some people mostly that are in the eastern parts of it. because so far the coup, I mean, until very recently, and in fact, Yanukovych exasperated this situation first with having the anti-protest law in December, so he really forced the protesters' hand to become more forceful in their reclaiming their freedoms and rights away from him. And then he signed more brutal laws and so on. So I think the government does have legitimacy, but because it came as a coup, and I agree with those who spoke about that, is that Putin now can use this as claiming this is a terrorist government. This government cannot protect our interests and cannot protect. We have to protect our own Black Sea because these people are not. And also the immediate, I think, another thing that really forced his hand more than some other things, although a lot of things, probably many things at the same time, is that one of the first orders of business was to cancel Russian as a state language. And I think that really spooked them very, very much, because if that happens, then the fleet goes, their other advantages go. And so Putin went really all the way in. So I guess, once again, sorry for being devil's advocate here, is legitimacy is who you ask. Many people say Yanukovych is illegitimate because he killed his own people and also defected, ran away, and was not even seen anywhere for 3 days. I mean, does he continue to be a legitimate president? I don't think so.
Stavros.
Going back to the point that Lucan made about elections, the legitimacy of the government. You've had a government. Yanukovych was elected. It was obviously a very dirty election, but it was, more or less the will of the people. And he's been removed and put in place people that have not been elected. So the need for an election, I think, is clear, and we're worried about Russia. But if we look at the longer term play to actually build that state and that stability, and I will say, having returned, it was 04 and 06, I mean, just in that period, and then going back there in 12, on to be more of a little pragmatic note, is that I will say very different than other places in the Soviet Union have been involved in elections. They know how to run elections. Don't mess with an Ukrainian when they're running elections. That babushka that's going to sit there, that lady, they will sit there for 12 hours and they won't go to the washroom to hold up. So the idea is there's some promise that to actually have an election right now in eastern Ukraine seems almost impossible. So if things can flush out a bit, they may be able to have something that has some legitimacy. And that's a big question mark if this government can transfer.
But okay, you've been there though. Can you have an election under these circumstances where things seem so chaotic in Kiev and parts of the West and foreign troops on their soil in the East? Can you have elections under those circumstances?
Do you have a choice?
Well, you do have a choice. You don't have to, or you do have to.
I would say that if this government wants to get that legitimacy and actually bring the nation together in the east of the country, they're going to have to go to the people. They've basically removed the person that they more or less, and frankly, let's be clear, a lot of people were holding their nose when they voted for Yanukovych. There's no love lost with Yanukovych being gone. So how do you get towards that? So in this larger picture, we all were excited here, 2004, things happened, we thought everything was going to change. But that path to democracy wasn't as clear. How do we try to support that path to democracy without just focusing on the bloodshed and worrying about the next maneuver of Putin? And I'm not saying that these things are not vital right now for the state to not collapse. It's just to get a larger discussion so that the policymakers are considering these things when they make a play or when they make a statement.
Gotcha. Lucan.
So I want to sort of emphasize one thing. I think that that Putin sees the current government as a bunch of nationalists, which is simply not true. The acting president is actually from Dnipropetrovsk, Turchinov. I know him. I've met him several times.
Which is in the east.
Which is in the east. He actually vetoed when the new government came to power. They reversed a pro-Russian language law. He on Sunday vetoed it. He's smart. He realizes that you need to bring Ukraine together. You need to bring in the Russians. And he's actually been, I think, given an impossible position, he's done a remarkable job. So I think I just want to emphasize, to be clear, that this is not some fascist nationalist government by any stretch of the imagination. These are people who desperately just want to hold the country together.
Walter, we did hear a few moments ago from Nina that the West kind of disappeared on this issue for 6 years. They didn't pay attention to all of the changes that were taking place over the past 6 years. As a result, we are where we are. The West has a bunch of options right now, none of which appear to be particularly good. It's not a question of good options versus bad options. It's bad options versus worse options. So if you're advising decision makers right now, Walter, what do you tell them to do?
You know, I think the first thing I would say, particularly to President Obama, but maybe to others who care about this, is if you care about the non-proliferation and the control of nuclear weapons, you can't ignore or write off Ukraine. In 1994, Ukraine was a nuclear weapons state. They were left in Ukraine when the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine did what the world asked it to do and voluntarily turned its nuclear weapons over to Russia. In exchange, at least in theory, it got some security guarantees from the US, the UK, and Russia, none of which appear to be worth very much. Now, I suspect that if Ukraine still had nuclear weapons, Putin might have had another couple of minutes thought, at least, before going into Ukraine, into Crimea. But also, here's this. Do you really think the Iranians are going to give their nuclear weapons up if they discover that promises made in exchange for that are completely empty and vapid? You know, we should not be thinking of this simply in terms of some, geopolitical incident in some country a very long way away that doesn't have any grand importance. The decisions that the West takes about Ukraine, whatever they may be, are going to be extremely fateful. And if Ukraine is sort of left to twist in the wind, then I can guarantee you that non-proliferation is going to have a very tough time in coming decades. We are likely to see the number of nuclear states increase.
Nina, I have not heard a single person on any side of this argument suggest that the West or NATO needs to send troops in to match what Putin has done. So short of military invasion, from the West side of things, what are the West's options?
Well, I mean, it has been, let's just assume that military invasion now is not an option, because what are you going to have war with Russia? That's just not a viable solution, I think. G8 has been cited as a big leverage. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I mean, Russia shouldn't have been part of G8 to start with. Should be G7 because it really had no reason at the time. wasn't capacity wise, it was really not enough. Anyway, so Russia could lose that status, which may or may not affect Putin's decision. On the other, Putin's actions. On the other hand, he will just say, well, the West is always out to get me, so of course. But there are other alternatives. I mean, there's a South Stream gas pipe that can be somehow blocked, stopped, and Russians wouldn't really get any leverage on that. The ruble is collapsing, so I assume economically that there are very many opportunities. You block accounts and not just the Russian oligarchs or Russian politicians. Visa restrictions can come in, and I don't know how many Russians, as much as they may support Putin and his annexation of Crimea because, it was so originally ours, Russians want to travel. They don't want to live in a closed country. They want their bank accounts in Switzerland and London. They really don't want to be without money. If ruble goes down and economy goes bunkers, I don't know how powerful Putin will be. And the last point I want to make on the Black Sea, great, he has the fleet. I'm sure it is within some sort of NATO jurisdiction to stop the Russian fleet getting out of Black Sea. So they would have no access anywhere else. So fine, they can traverse the Black Sea as much as they want.
Well, that's one of the things, Jeff, I've heard is that some have suggested, hey, United States, move your Sixth Fleet closer to the action.
Right.
Is that a good idea?
Yeah, well, that might be a bit much. They could do that. That would be a particularly bellicose move. There is regulations of what can actually go through the Bosphorus past Turkey. They can't take anything out over a certain size. But this government in Turkey, Erdogan, is quite friendly towards Putin. So I wouldn't really count on the Turks bottling up the Black Sea fleet in the Black Sea. But what I think is on the table now, and it's pretty clear, and this is a bad choice, I want to be clear about this, is isolating Putin. It's time to isolate him.
It is time to isolate him.
It is time to isolate him. The problem with that is there's a lot of costs associated with isolating him, right? We do a lot of business with Russia. It will be bad for Russians. A lot of Russians, and not just the middle class. It might destabilize the Putin regime, but it'll also cost us. it will cost the Europeans. It's not clear to me. Right? The Europeans depend particularly on Russian gas going through Ukraine.
So they won't go along with it.
Right. It's not clear to me that the Europeans will go along with this at all. The Europeans, on matters of foreign policy, the Europeans have shown time and again to be relentlessly, cynically, and bloodlessly realist, right? They really don't, I mean, this goes back a very long way, right? The kind of idealism of foreign policy that tries to promote democracy, that's a particularly North American, or especially American project. The Europeans want their gas. And unless we're willing to try to find them a different source, it's going to be hard. The only thing I would conclude by saying is that the only thing that's true, more true that the Europeans want to buy the gas, the Russians want to sell it. Right? And this is always the case with energy powers. It's their only source of revenue. That's the soft spot. That's the vulnerability. The vulnerability are the big sources of revenue to Russia, and that's the way to isolate, right? And that's what they're going to have to do if they really want to head down the road of isolation.
Any useful options in the West right now?
Well, I think that, as much as I agree with the previous statements about the dangers of proliferation, I just don't think there's much the West can do, at least in the short term. I mean, basically, Russia's a big power, has nuclear weapons, it provides energy for much of Europe. You can't tell Putin what to do. I think you can increase the medium-term costs, but it's actually not clear that isolation hurts Putin. After all, one of the things he doesn't like is the fact that all the oligarchs have accounts in the West. Well, you freeze the bank accounts, guess what? All the money comes back to Russia. Is that so bad for Putin? I don't know. And so it's actually not clear, what it is that we can do. And I actually think it's really important. One of the things we can do, two things. One, we can de-escalate. I actually think it's a real mistake to escalate the situation. We want to prevent an all-out war. So far, we don't have an all-out war. I think maybe we can help prevent that in two ways. One is not to sort of make these bellicose moves that the Republicans are suggesting that Obama do in the United States is one thing. And also, I think we can have influence over one entity where we have enormous influence is over the Ukrainian government, and encouraging these actions to sort of be inclusive, to have elections as soon as possible, not to send in paramilitaries into Crimea, which I'm sure many of the nationalists there are urging them to do. So I think there are some things to do, but I think West options are just very limited.
How's that going to move Putin, though? I mean,
it's not going to move Putin. He has the Black Sea. I just don't see. And I think for him, in his sort of Cold War mindset, he has a chip on the chessboard.
I want to get Walter in here because Walter, we're about to lose our satellite to you in just a couple of minutes, so I want to get one more question out of you if I can, and that is, Barack Obama is sitting down presumably at some point in the near future with his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor, and he's saying, I need some options, people. What do they tell him?
I think they're trying to figure that out right now, and I think the first thing that they've got to do is talk to Chancellor Merkel. I think that Germany's position on this is going to be crucial, and I think if the United States is working with Germany right from the beginning to try to develop a common position, then even if that position isn't as tough as one might ideally want to see, it's going to be one that the West as a whole can stick to. So in the short term, I say that. In the long term, I say frack, baby, frack. I think that the way that North America, the United States and Canada, and for that matter, Mexico, can really change the calculation here is Europe's energy sources need to be diversified. And exporting some oil and some LNG to Europe is one of the ways that we can normalize Russia in the world long term. And I think that would be the kind of response that again, won't fix today's problem, but it would be an unmistakable sign to Russia and to the rest of the world which way power is really headed.
But can presidential advisors go into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, you have no good options, just do nothing. Sit on the sidelines, watch this play out. There's nothing you can do anyway. Can they actually say that?
Well, doing nothing is often one of the boxes that presidents have, to check. And sometimes presidents check that box.
Gotcha. Walter Russell Meade, it's good of you to join us on the line from New York City. Thanks so much, as always, for your contributions to our programs.
Thank you.
All right, let's continue on here. There is something called R2P, the responsibility to protect. Canada was involved in the creation of this doctrine, which you people who do foreign affairs for a living really like. Somebody is going to make the argument that there are people in eastern Ukraine right now whose liberty, whose justice, is in jeopardy and that we need to intervene.
The Russians
Go ahead.
The Russians are making that argument. As a matter of fact, they were involved in R2P as well, you have to remember, right? The problem with R2P is that it gets used when you want it to, when you want to use it, right? So, I mean, one of the grand ironies is Kerry is standing up there right now, and Secretary Kerry in the United States is standing up right now and saying, you can't invade Crimea, it's sovereign territory, right? Well, you're telling the Americans that they can't invade a sovereign territory. It's pretty tough. It's Americans telling the Russians that they can't invade a sovereign territory. It's pretty tough to do right
Given
now.
Iraq, Afghanistan.
Well, it's a case of the pot calling the kettle black. And so this is also the problem with R2P. However, if there really is a war there, I mean, we're not there, and I think Lucan's right. Everything should be done to de-escalate at this point, right? Try to let cooler heads prevail, to try to let the Ukrainians come together, and the election is the way to do that. That is the Western way of trying to bring everybody together and creating legitimacy. If they're not able to do that, right, and things get nasty, yeah, that's when normal human beings suffer. And we in the West, over and over again, have shown that public opinion usually doesn't like to sit around and watch innocent people die.
Nina, anything to add on that?
No, I agree, because that has been Putin's argument, is that he is protecting his responsibility to protect Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic population all around Ukraine, because they are suffering from an illegitimate terrorist coup, as Prime Minister Medvedev, the words he used. So they are using this argument, and they also, for humanitarianism, they are using the argument of the United States. Basically, Putin's stance is that the United States can go because they don't like governments, because they cite the will of the people, because there are humanitarian dangers. And so the way he sees it, and quite genuinely, that he's doing the same thing. And he's almost puzzled, I'm sure, that Barack Obama doesn't recognize him. Once again, proves his belief that the West is always out to get us. Whatever they do, there's an expression in Russian, что можно льву, нельзя собаке. Whatever the lion can do, the dog cannot. And his point always is, I am not your dog.
Mind you, the lion and the dog had 90 minutes on the phone over the weekend together, which I guess once you go through translations is really a 45-minute phone call. But Nina, obviously none of us was in on the call, but can you speculate as to the tone and nature of that phone call?
Well, they seem tough. I mean, Barack Obama seemed to be saying something that we repeatedly hear from Secretary Kerry, that it's a sovereign nation, you cannot do that. Putin laid out his arguments on humanitarianism, on securing the rights of the Russian population, on all these things that he has been saying, or the Russians have been saying about the annexation or whatever, the invasion, I don't know what the word to use, of entering Crimea, let's put it this way, military entering Crimea. And apparently what I understood, that Barack Obama kept saying, you cannot do that. This is not an argument that I can have. And I'm sure Putin would say, what about you doing this and doing that? Because another thing to remember about Russia at all times, that zero-sum mentality or zero-sum game is the game they are always playing. They may not often have an eight game, but zero-sum is always there. So whatever Obama's anti-Crimean invasion or military entrance argument were, Putin would be replying right back that that's not the case. Maybe that's why it was such a long conversation. I also, last point, I really want to say that I totally agree about the involvement of Angela Merkel, because it does seem that from all the world leaders at this point, now Berlusconi is gone, so that's not a question anymore. But Angela Merkel and Germany are the only, so Angela Merkel of Germany is the only person he may not like very much, but certainly respects. So really, she should be the head of that negotiation with Putin, probably not the United States.
Lucan.
Yeah, no, I think, the problem is that you have Putin who's living in a different universe. And in his mind, the revolution was an incursion by the West. He sees he basically sees Western spy agencies as behind all opposition. So in his mind, it's completely hypocritical for us to say you can't intervene when he sees the revolution as a product of Western intervention, so he responds. And so I'm not sure what you do in that context, but But I think it makes it very much harder to come to any kind of agreement.
Jeffrey.
It's interesting. Merkel did speak to Putin. This was reported already in the German press, and I was reading it before I came here. Putin, of course, is a completely fluent German speaker. He got up and gave a speech in the Bundestag in German. He was a spy in East Germany during the Cold War, so he speaks excellent German. Merkel's response to that, her talk with Putin, was quite disturbing. She said he was basically kind of incoherent. And not incoherent in the sense of crazy, but incoherent that he had no real plan. It's not actually clear why he did this, what his actual intentions were. It wasn't very comforting. And while I think Walter Russell Meade, Nina, and everybody in the panel here says it's true, the Germans are important not simply because Putin has a relationship with Merkel. They're also important because any hope of a common European response has got to come with the German lead. Right? It's got to come with German and French lead. But the idea that somehow Merkel's going to solve this for us, I don't think so. I think Putin is really marching to his own drummer here, very much so, in a way that we haven't seen this much before. This guy, to be a great statesman, you have to not only be prudent, you also have to have, under the right conditions, I think the technical word is chutzpah. And Putin has shown himself time and again in both how he grabbed power initially back in 2000. You have to remember how brutal he was when he grabbed power in 2000, killing his own people. And I think that he's showing more of the same today. He really is a bit of a gambler when push comes to shove. Now, how one responds to that kind of person, it has to be steady. Right? And I think it has to be clear. Merkel has to be on board for that, for making it steady and clear.
Can I just, a quick follow-up here? We saw the pictures of those Russian troops just coming in.
Right.
Without a shot fired. Did that surprise you?
No, that didn't surprise me. What did surprise me is, first of all, they're allowing a lot of journalists to run around and photograph them. Everybody's photographing them, the LA Times, the New York Times, and if you look at how these Russian soldiers are dressed, first of all, there's no insignia at all, right? But if you look at so they're not obviously from Russia. If you look at their license plates, however, on their cars do say RU on them, which is the Russian license plate. The other thing I would say, they are armed to the teeth. Right? They have beautiful, beautiful uniforms, level 4 flak jackets, laser-guided sight weapons, of course AK-47s, that's their gun. I mean, it's a beautiful kind of spectacle that Putin is putting on for the whole world.
So if you're a Ukrainian soldier...
Look how strong we are. You want to fight us right now? It's a big statement to everybody else.
A few minutes to go here. Stavros, you've been there. Where do you see this going?
Well, on a certain economic level, I mean, I look at kind of meat and potatoes that if they can't pay the pensions, where's that support going to erode in those little places, those grandmothers who are now taking pensions, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, they maybe watched their parents lose everything. So the fear of the 90s, these constant collapses over the years, and the people's lives being, gutted in some ways because of that. So if in that just economic sense, which is going to have major repercussions in Russia. So that's one where, that might actually help us determine, or help the interim government determine if they can actually do something like run an election, things like that.
And we're told they need multiple billions of dollars immediately just to keep all of the infrastructure in place that you're talking about here.
Yeah, so that's an open question, but that's a solvable problem of money being put into the system. It's a short-term one. But that one is more than I can speak to. Well, some of the army issues and stuff I'm not so familiar with, so I'll abstain from commenting.
Okay, Nina, last 30 seconds here. Where do you see this going?
I think it's going to end badly for Putin either way. He can have his Crimea, he may have it for some while, but I really think basically he's going to choke on Ukraine. I think this time around he really took more that he could swallow, and it's going to, and I don't want to predict politics because it's the really idiotic exercise, but if one of the scenarios I believe really is that he's going to deeply lose, and perhaps even lose because of his own people, because he really does look increasingly Napoleonic and increasingly ridiculous. And as powerful as he may be, and who wants a great country that cannot pay for itself or let its people travel? So my fear is for Putin that his own people are going to take him out.
That's Nina Khrushcheva from the New School for Public Engagement via Skype out of New York City. Thanks, Nina, for being with us from New York today. Jeffrey Kopstein from the University of Toronto, his colleague Lucan Way, also at the U of T. Stavros Rugas, formerly a producer here on The Agenda. It's good to see you again, Stavros, also having spent time in Ukraine as an elections monitor. Good of all of you to join us tonight for this. Thanks so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.